Night, so it's time once again for another bedtime Bible story with me. The last time we met, we talked about Daniel walking the fine line between rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and rendering unto God what is God's. Well, sometimes you're not able to walk that fine line and render to Caesar what's his and render to God's what his. Sometimes we just have to render to God. And that's the basis of our story tonight as we follow Daniel's three friends, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar got it into his head that he should construct a statue for the people of Babylon to worship. He made it out of gold. It was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. And every day at a specified time, he had some musicians begin to strike up the band, and as soon as everybody heard the music played, they were to face towards the statue and bow down and worship, along with all of the other gods that they worshipped in Babylon. The penalty for not bowing down and worshiping the statue was that one would be thrown into a fiery furnace. So the statue was constructed, it was dedicated, and the music began to play, and on cue, everybody began to bow down and worship the statue. Everybody, well, except for Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. We assume Daniel too didn't bow down, but he's not in the story, just those three. Why? We're not sure, but I guess in the end it doesn't really matter. But Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they were not about to bow down to this statue that Nebuchadnezzar had constructed, because the first commandment is pretty plain. You shall have no other gods. They'd have to disobey God. They would have to disobey the first commandment. They would have to give their heart, mind, body, and soul to another God, a God that they didn't believe in, a God they knew for sure didn't exist. They didn't want to divide their heart. They wanted to remain faithful, and they were willing to pay the penalty. Well, as it was, they were foreigners in a foreign land, and they held some pretty high positions within the scope of the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. And some astrologers found out that Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego weren't bowing down. And so they went and they told Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, did you not make a decree that when the band struck up their tune, the people were to bow down and worship the statue that you constructed?" And Nebuchadnezzar said, "Yes, that's true." "Well, three of your palace workers, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they aren't bowing down to the statue. They need to be thrown into the fiery furnace." Nebuchadnezzar was mystified. He knew Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. He liked Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They were some of his best trusted and wisest workers. And so he went to them. He went to them in anger, and he said to them, "Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, is it true? Is it true that you're not bowing down to the statue that I had made when the band strikes up their tune? If that's so, you're going to have to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And what God is there that is able to save you?" There was Nebuchadnezzar's first mistake. What God is there that is able to save you? For all of the gods that exist in the world, they are just of the imaginations and the creation of man. But the true and living God, our God, He exists long before we ever did. In fact, He created us, not we Him. If there was any God that was going to be able to save Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, then it was their God, the true and living God, the only God. Well, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego had an answer for Nebuchadnezzar. "Nebuchadnezzar, if our God so chooses, He can save us. And if He does save us, then we won't have bowed down to your God, to your statue. And you're going to look pretty foolish when we come walking out of the furnace. But if He chooses not to save us, then we still will not have bowed down to your statue, and we have no plans to bow down to your statue. Well, this enraged Nebuchadnezzar all the more. He gave the order. He didn't really want to, but he was so angry that they were disobeying him because he liked them so much. They had to be thrown into the furnace. In fact, he gave an order that the furnace should be stoked hotter and hotter and hotter than it had ever been stoked before. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, wearing their turbans, their flowing robes, and other pieces of clothing, they were all bound up with rope, and they were led to the furnace. The furnace had been stoked so hot, hotter than it had ever been before, that the men that were actually putting Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego into the furnace, they were killed by the intensity of the flames. But in the fire they went. The door was shut, and Nebuchadnezzar was watching. And after a few minutes, he was puzzled, he was astounded, he was confused, he was flabbergasted. "Did we not put 3 people into the furnace?" he said. "I see 4. I see Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and I see one like a son of man walking within the confines of the furnace." And Nebuchadnezzar called out to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, "Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego, you come out of that furnace." And out they walked. And everybody gathered around, even the astrologers that had brought to Nebuchadnezzar's attention that they weren't bowing down to his golden statue. As they gathered around them, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, their clothes weren't smelling of smoke, of fire. They weren't burnt in any way, shape, or form. Their hair on their head was not singed. It was though they had never been put into the furnace. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had to change his mind now. Otherwise, he'd be looking pretty silly. So he made a new decree that whoever does not bow down to the God of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, well, they won't be thrown into a fiery furnace. They're going to be cut up in pieces. Well, I guess we could say, God 1, Nebuchadnezzar 0. But the real point of this story is the faith of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in their God. If our God so chooses, they said. They knew full well that God may choose to save them, and God may choose not to save them. But he certainly has the power to deliver them. There is no other God that can. For you see, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego knew something that a lot of people haven't figured out yet. That whether we live or whether we die, we live to the Lord. If we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So either way, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego won. They were in a win-win situation. If they live and God saved them, they wouldn't have bowed down. They would have remained faithful. They would have had their earthly life still to live. If God had allowed them to die in the fiery furnace, well, they still wouldn't have bowed down to the statue, and they would still be alive, not in the world, but in the glory of heaven with the God who had created them and the God who had promised a Redeemer to them. Now there is some faith. All because, well, there comes a time sometimes when we can't walk that fine line and we have to worship God and God alone. We have to stand for God and God alone, and, well, maybe it means paying the consequences. But the consequences are always God saves us or God doesn't save us. He lets us go to heaven, and, well, then we're still saved. So render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God. But sometimes push comes to shove, and we have to make a decision by faith, a decision to stay faithful to the only God who can save us no matter what. That's what I love about that story of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Well, that's the story for tonight. I have another one coming up on Wednesday night. So the Lord guide you waking and guard you sleeping, that awake you may watch with Christ, and asleep you may rest in peace. Nighty-night.